this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
It's an Olympics you'll never forget. Prime time in Milan. The moments.
Chloe Kim with the gold medal flex.
The stars.
Ilya Malinin.
Out of this world.
The spectacle from beautiful northern Italy with very special guests every night of the Olympics. Experience the world's biggest show. Prime time in Milan. Tonight, 8/7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
The big game commercials are basically must-see TV. This year, Elf Cosmetics went all out with an absurdly funny telenovela called Melissa. It stars Melissa McCarthy, Nicholas Gonzalez, Itati Cantoral, and Elf Glow Reviver Lip Oil. The Elf Glow Reviver Lip Oil is an ultra-glossy tinted lip oil that nourishes, hydrates, and enhances your lips' natural color.
Watch the full episode of their new Elf novela on soyunbaño.com.
Ever wonder why so many people regain weight after stopping a GLP-1? Up to 40% of the weight lost can come from lean muscle. This weakens the body, slows metabolism, and makes it easier to put the pounds back on, creating a cycle of dependency. Prolon's 5-day fasting-mimicking diet offers a drug-free way to maintain results and support long-term metabolic health. In just 5 days, it activates fasting pathways to burn fat, protect muscle, and rejuvenate cells, all while letting you enjoy real food. Get 15% off plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe at prolonlife.com/iHeart. That's prolonlife.com/iHeart.
You see it instantly. It's Coldwater Creek, the mark of exceptional workmanship and signature touches inspired by a Mountain West heritage. Distinctive styles created from quality fabrics, silhouettes perfected with just the right drape, feel-good fits offering ease of movement, and thoughtful details to elevate your look. Coldwater Creek's authenticity is embodied in every piece, embracing its confident spirit that carries through to today. Discover Coldwater Creek clothing, designed to fit your life the way you want. For a wardrobe you can count on season after season, visit coldwatercreek.com. Shop the new spring collection at 20% off $75 or more with code IHEART20.
Welcome to One Thing Trump Did, available exclusively on the Middle podcast feed. I'm Jeremy Hobson. This is a special edition as we respond to the news of the U.S. strikes on Iran. The decision to get the U.S. involved militarily in the conflict has already been called one of the most, if not the most, consequential decisions President Trump has ever made.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the 3 key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success.
The strikes were a surprise not just in Iran, but around the world, including here in the United States, where many Americans are asking why the U.S. is getting involved in this war that was between Israel and Iran. Joining me now is Ken Pollack, Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute and author of a number of books on this subject, including Unthinkable: Iran, the Bomb, and American Strategy. Ken Pollack, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on, Jeremy.
So people are still processing what's happened in the last few days. Were you surprised by these airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities by the United States?
Good question. Yeah, maybe a little bit. Look, Donald Trump is very unpredictable. And obviously, I was following this very closely. Initially, it seemed like he was leaning towards striking. Then it seemed like he was leaning against. And then, of course, he attacked. So, no, it didn't completely surprise me, but maybe a little bit. But again, I've just learned that with Donald Trump, you learn to expect the unexpected.
But as you've been studying this for so many years and even decades, this has been something that many presidents could have done when it comes to the nuclear program in Iran, but they didn't do it. So what are the immediate consequences of the U.S. actually doing something like this?
Well, look, first, you're right. This is something a lot of presidents have looked at and more or less all said, don't want to do it, way too risky. We should also note, this is a situation where a lot of Israeli prime ministers, including Benjamin Netanyahu, have looked at in the past and also said, don't want to do it.
Right.
In terms of the consequences, there are two broad sets of issues out there that we need to be thinking about. One, I think we are thinking about already. People are very focused on that. That is the question of Iranian retaliation. Are they going to come after our forces in the region? Do they go after our Gulf allies? Do they attack oil exports from the region? This is an important set of considerations. We can absolutely talk about that. And I think it's good that we're focused on it. I'll say I'm less concerned about that, though, than I am with the other set where I don't really think we're focused enough. And that is the long-term consequences. And in particular, whether these strikes, the Israeli and now American strikes, lead to this Iranian regime never getting a nuclear weapon, or whether they assure us that this regime is going to get nuclear weapons. Right? The big issue out there is they have now been attacked. They've been attacked by Israel. They've been attacked by America. There are a lot of Iranians, a lot of Iranian leaders who've always wanted a nuclear weapon, and they're going to now be in a position to say, this is why we need nuclear weapons, because the Americans and Israelis would never dare to attack us if we have them. And this is what we've seen with other instances like that in places like Iraq and Iran itself, where attacking the nuclear program can become an incentive for them to go and get nuclear weapons.
So you think that the attack happened because the U.S. and I guess Israel are sure that they don't already have a nuclear weapon at this point, but that they were getting so close that these countries decided we've got to do this now so that they don't get one?
Exactly. Everyone is quite confident that Iran does not have nuclear weapons. I think that is exactly right. The Israelis have been worried about Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon for at least 30 years. And I think it's clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu felt like he had a window of opportunity. There was just a harmonic convergence of a lot of different things that made an Israeli strike easier, better, less risky than it would at any other time. I think that's why he went ahead and did it. And I think that once the Israelis started it, then President Trump began thinking about whether he wanted to join in. And that's effectively what I think has happened.
But it did look, as you said, like he was not going to do that. He said there's going to be a 2-week pause. There are a lot of voices that came out and said, we don't want to get involved in this war. This is Israel's fight. This is even Tucker Carlson on the right had that very famous interview with Ted Cruz where he went after him for suggesting that the U.S. get involved in something like this. So why do you think the president just ignored those calls and decided to go for it?
So first point I'll make, Jeremy, is I'm an old intelligence analyst. I began my career at CIA, and we're taught to look for indicators and warnings that things are going to happen. And for me, one indicator that President Trump was planning to do this, was certainly thinking very hard about doing it, was when he went after Tucker Carlson. Right? The fact that he was so dismissive of Tucker's complaints suggested to me that he really was interested in doing this. As to why he ultimately did it, it's very hard to say, because you got to get into the head of another person. And, Donald Trump is, he's not quite sui generis, but he thinks about things very differently from myself. I think that there was certainly an element of, he saw the Israelis waging this incredible military campaign, right? The Israelis are tactically brilliant when it comes to military operations. They were doing all of this stuff. They were getting tremendous credit for their skill, their creativity, the power that they were demonstrating, right? And this is something that all of these things are things that I think Donald Trump really admires. He too wants to be seen as powerful. He too wants to be seen as skillful and creative. And I think that he wanted a piece of that. I think that, there's also the element of he wanted a deal with the Iranians Iranians. He wanted that before the Israelis attacked. And I suspect that he also believed that by joining in this war, he either would be able to get rid of Iran's nuclear program as a problem for the United States in the Middle East, or perhaps open things up to getting the deal that he's always wanted. And I think that I will say, I think that prospect is still out there, but this has definitely complicated that diplomatic situation.
Iran sent its foreign minister to Moscow to ask Vladimir Putin for more help after the U.S. strikes. How are countries, including Russia and China, involved in what's happening right now?
So what's been most noteworthy so far, Jeremy, is the fact that they really haven't been. The Chinese and the Russians are both complaining, but they're not doing anything. And the truth is, certainly the Chinese, other countries, don't really have much ability to do anything. The Chinese trade a lot with the Middle East. They buy a lot of its oil. They don't have much ability to affect these circumstances. They certainly don't have the military capability to intervene there. They don't have much ability to stop the United States or Israel, for that matter. Russia's a more interesting question, right? And for Russia, they both have a very close relationship to Iran, but so does China. But what's most interesting and important about Russia is Vladimir Putin's relationship with Donald Trump. Right? This is a relationship that I don't think any of us really understands or can really explain. I've heard any number of people offer different explanations for exactly what is going on there. All we can really say is that Donald Trump seems to be quite close to Vladimir Putin, seems to respect the man, to admire him, to feel a certain kinship with him. And again, we don't know what it is, but there is a degree of influence there between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. But Vladimir Putin seems to have a lot of influence on Donald Trump. And I think that's really what the Iranians are looking for. Would they like some military assistance? Sure. Would they like the Russians to threaten the United States? Sure. But I don't think that they are expecting any of that. Russia is tied up with its own war in Ukraine that is taxing its military as it is. Russia has no real ability to threaten the United States at this point in time. The one thing that Russia has is Vladimir Putin's ability to convince Donald Trump to do things that he probably otherwise wouldn't. I think that's what the Iranians are trying to do, is get Putin to use whatever voodoo he's got to get Trump to back off.
But on that note, I would assume that Russia was not happy to hear about the strikes against Iran by the United States.
No, absolutely not. Russia never likes it when the United States uses its military power, just as we don't like it when Russia uses its own. And of course, Russia condemned it, called it illegal, which of course is a bit rich from a country that has been attacking Ukraine for the last 3 years.
You mentioned some of the other things that you may be worried about in the more short term in terms of Iran's retaliation. One of the things that's been talked about is closing the Strait of Hormuz, which is a big oil shipping route. Who would lose the most if Iran did that? And do you think Iran would do that? Because it's not just the United States that would be hurt by something like that.
Sure. So who loses the most? We all do. Okay. The Strait of Hormuz is absolutely critical to the global economy. And every country in the world is linked to the global economy, starting with the United States of America. If there is a shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz for a long period of time, oil prices will soar, and it will cripple all of our economies. As you're pointing out, though, Jeremy, it also cripples Iran's economy, right? Our economy is dependent on oil because of transportation, because everything ultimately is dependent on that. Petrochemicals, plastics, a whole variety of other things. Iran is dependent on its oil exports for 60 to 70% of its government revenue, right? In addition to communications, transportation, everything else. So the Iranians lose in a big way. Even more important than that, the Iranians seem to understand that if they shut down the Strait of Hormuz, pretty much the entire world is going to turn against their regime overnight because of the impact it will have on everyone's economy. I think there's a high expectation in Tehran, which is the place where this matters, that the United States would immediately begin a massive military operation to reopen the strait. And Wars are unpredictable. We can never be certain about this, but especially given the incredible incompetence of Iranian military forces that we've seen in their fight against Israel over the last several weeks, so you can pitch it back to April of last year and say over months, right? It seems highly likely that the United States will be able to obliterate, if I can use that word, Iran's military forces in and around the Strait of Hormuz in a matter of weeks. And so the strait gets reopened and Iran loses that military power as well.
Speaking of obliterating, do you think that we know whether the strikes were actually effective in obliterating Iran's nuclear capabilities?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, Jeremy, because I'm quite concerned about this. Yes, President Trump used the word obliterated when talking about the 3 Iranian nuclear facilities that the United States bombed on Saturday evening. You've had the Pentagon come in with a more restrained, but nonetheless very positive assessment of the amount of damage that was done. And look, the 2 of the facilities, Natanz and Esfahan, I'm quite convinced that we did do a tremendous amount of damage there. They weren't terribly well protected, certainly not protected the way that the 3rd site, Fordo, was protected. And there, again, I'm an old intel analyst. I also served at the White House. I want to know why the U.S. government is being so optimistic in its battle damage assessment. I looked at the satellite imagery. I see a couple of holes, and I see some shifted surface earth. I don't see anything that tells me for sure that this deep underground facility that is also insulated with enormous amounts of concrete and steel, that this thing has been obliterated or even severely damaged. I want to know how we know that. Is this based on modeling? Is this based on other intelligence? Is this based on Israeli human sources? Until the government explains why it is so confident, I'm skeptical. President Trump likes to call everything he does a wild success and then insists that his administration back him up on that. On this one, I'm from Missouri. You got to show me.
Do you think that Israel and the United States are on the same page at this point? Because after the strikes by the U.S., Trump said Iran better not retaliate. It was time for peace. But then since then, there have been more Israeli strikes on Iran.
Yeah, this is a great question, Jeremy, because I think you're right that there's actually a lot more daylight between the United States and Israel than either government wants to let on. First of all, the Israelis want to make sure that they have completely obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. They also want to take out as much of Iran's ballistic missile capability as they possibly can. And they are looking to kill as many of Iran's military leaders and weapons scientists as they possibly can to really set back this program as much as it is possible for them to do so, in part because I think that they are concerned that they won't necessarily get another shot like this in the future. I think it's very clear the Trump administration wants this thing to end pretty quickly. They're really focused on the nuclear issue. They're not particularly concerned about anything else beyond it. And what the president is really focused on is ending the program, being able to say he ended it, whether it's by his strikes or by a deal. That's what he's focused on. And even then, let's also remember the Israelis are very, very concerned about Iran's actions in the region. Right? They are, the Iranians have been waging a war against them across the region. The U.S., I think the Trump administration is somewhat concerned about it, but it's not a priority for them. And in fact, I could make an argument. I think that there is some evidence already, we'll find out more after the fact, that part of the reason that Israel decided to do the strike and to do it before the Trump administration's diplomacy had fully played out is because they were nervous that the Trump administration was about to sign a deal with Iran, which would satisfy America's concerns, but not necessarily Israel.
Well, stay with us because when we come back, we're going to talk about how this conflict could further escalate, what it would mean for U.S. involvement. One thing Trump did with Middle East Institute Vice President of Policy Ken Pollack. We'll be right back.
An Olympics you'll never forget. Prime time in Milan. The moments.
Chloe Kim with the gold medal flex.
The stars.
Ilya Malinin.
Out of this world.
The spectacle from beautiful northern Italy with very special guests every night of the Olympics. Experience the world's biggest show. Prime time in Milan, tonight 8/7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
You see it instantly. It's Coldwater Creek, the mark of exceptional workmanship and signature touches inspired by a Mountain West heritage. Distinctive styles created from quality fabrics, silhouettes perfected with just the right drape, feel-good fits offering ease of movement, and thoughtful details to elevate your look. Coldwater Creek's authenticity is embodied in every piece, embracing its confident spirit that carries through to today. Discover Coldwater Creek clothing, designed to fit your life the way you want. For a wardrobe you can count on season after season, visit coldwatercreek.com. Shop the new spring collection at 20% off $75 or more with code IHEART20.
Welcome to the A Building. I'm Hans Charles.
I'm Menelik Lumumba. It's 1969. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. had both been assassinated, and Black America was at a breaking point. Rioting and protests broke out on an unprecedented scale.
In Atlanta, Georgia, at Martin's alma mater, Morehouse College, the students had their own protest. It featured two prominent figures in Black history, Martin Luther King Sr. and a young student, Samuel L. Jackson.
To be in what we really thought was a revolution. I mean, people were dying.
1968, the murder of Dr. King, which traumatized everyone.
The FBI had a role in the murder of a Black Panther leader in Chicago.
This story is about protest. It echoes in today's world far more than it should, and it will blow your mind.
Listen to the A Building on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Ryder Strong, and I have a new podcast called The Red Weather.
It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea.
In 1995, my neighbor, Anna Trainer, disappeared from a commune.
It was hard to wrap your head around. It was nature and trees and praying and drugs.
So no, I am not your guru.
And back then, I lied to my parents, I lied to police, I lied to everybody.
There were years, Ryder, where I could not say your name.
I've decided to go back to my hometown in Northern California, interview my friends, family, talk to police, journalists, whomever I can, to try to find out what actually happened.
Isn't it a little bit weird that they obsess over hippies in the woods and not the obvious boyfriend?
They have had this case for 30 years.
I'll teach you sons of to come around here and my wife.
Boom, boom. This is The Red Weather. Listen to The Red Weather on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to One Thing Trump Did, exclusively on the Middle podcast feed. I'm Jeremy Hobson. This episode, we're talking about Iran following the U.S. strikes on the country's nuclear program, and I'm joined by Ken Pollack, Vice President of Policy with the Middle East Institute. Ken Pollack, Trump made some more headlines, as he often does, after the strikes when he started talking about regime change and whether that could be a good idea. What did you think about that?
So I'm going to put it this way, Jeremy. I don't know what is in President Trump's mind. And again, he clearly thinks about these things very, very differently from me. So I need to be careful here. That said, I'm going to give him credit and say I think that what he's trying to do is what the U.S. needs to do at this point in time. And it's very, very hard to do. This is where you need outstanding diplomats. What the U.S. needs to do right now is to simultaneously convince the Iranian regime that we're not pursuing regime change now, but we could shift and pursue regime change if the Iranians don't do what we want them to do, which is stop shooting at Israel and agree to give up their nuclear program completely and allow inspectors to do everything that they need to do in perpetuity so that we can be certain that they won't rebuild their nuclear program, right? That's what needs to happen now. The U.S. needs to convince Iran to do those things, and that's really hard. That's where you'd like someone like a Jim Baker or a George Shultz or a Dean Acheson, some outstanding diplomat who could go in and negotiate in this very, very subtle way using reassurance and threat to move the Iranians to where we need them to be. I think that's what President Trump is trying to do. He's just doing it in his own fashion, which, quite frankly, makes me very uncomfortable because he's a much more direct speaker, much more prone to braggadocio, as opposed to the subtlety that I think that we need now.
Well, and wouldn't regime change necessarily mean there would have to be U.S. boots on the ground?
So again, this is part of the problem, and I think you're getting at part of the issue, and it's something that a lot of Americans are very concerned about, myself included. Nobody wants the United States invading Iran. I once used the line that, if you like the Iraq War, you're going to love the Iran War because Iran is 3 times the population, 4 times the landmass, and 5 times the problems that Iraq had, right? But nonetheless, we've got to get the Iranians to realize, and we've got to get them to believe that there is something worse for them if they try to get a nuclear weapon at this point in time. And the one thing that is very clear that the Iranian leadership cares about even more than their nuclear program are their own lives and their hold on power, right? And so we have to be able to convince them, to threaten them that would be at risk if they pursue nuclear weapons, even while it's clear that there's really nobody here in the United States that would be willing to go that last mile that you're talking about of mounting an invasion, which is the only way for certain that you could change the regime in Iran. That said, there's certainly stuff that we and the Israelis are clearly signaling this, but they're doing it in a much more subtle way than the United States is, signaling that they have ways to kill key regime figures, potentially including Ayatollah Khamenei.
Well, and speaking of the hold on power that Iran's regime has, what do we know about how the people in Iran feel at this point about what is going on? We know it's a police state. We know that they're a very repressive regime. But do you sense any possible uprising on behalf of the people saying, you know what, get rid of the nuclear program or anything like that?
Yeah, so to give you a brief answer to a fantastic question that really requires a really long answer, Jeremy, you're right. It is a police state. Therefore, we have to be very careful about what we say about Iranian public opinion. We do not have great sources. Second point, it's been clear for years that there are a lot of Iranians who do not like their government. Basically every 2 to 4 years since 1999, you've had a huge segment of the Iranian population try to rise up and overthrow their government. There's obviously another segment that is happy with the government, that supports the government, but there are a lot of Iranians who are unhappy with it. But couple of problems. First, when people get bombed, they tend to get angry at the people bombing them, not so much their own leaders. It takes a long time for people to come to the conclusion that, you know what, this is really the fault of our leaders for going down this path and bringing the bombing on us. World War II, every country hoped that their bombing campaign would have that impact. And what we found was it took a long time and an enormous amount of bombing and damage to really push people to that point. The truth of the matter is that Germans and Japanese, even to the end of the war, most of them were angry at the Allies, much more so than their own government. And this is the problem. And then the last thing is, again, this regime has demonstrated a tremendous ability to keep control over a population that clearly wants it gone. So actually achieving regime change, especially by bombing alone, would be a very tall order.
What do you make of the, relative silence from other countries that would be U.S. allies in a conflict? I mean, we remember the coalition of the willing in the Iraq War, and even a much bigger coalition in the fight in Afghanistan. What do you think about the fact that we haven't heard much support from, our typical allies in Europe and North America and other parts of the world?
Sure. Another great question. So I think what you can take away from that is that they are both conflicted and frightened. First of all, big difference between either the U.S. invasion of Iraq or the Persian Gulf War of 1990-91. The United States isn't bringing tens of thousands of troops into the region, saying this is going to be a massive effort in which we will protect you. So they're frightened. They're frightened of how Iran might respond. They're not entirely certain of how much the United States will protect them. They also, let's recognize, one level, they like what Israel has done. They hate the Iranians. They're afraid of the Iranians. They like seeing Iranian military power destroyed, degraded. But they're always nervous about the Israelis too, and the ability of the Israelis to just act freely in this kind of a fashion. It leaves many of them asking, gee, at what point in time might the Israelis decide to do that against us? Well, beyond that, again, take that point, take both those points. They hate the Iranians, but they're also kind of nervous about the Israelis. And, at the end of the day, they're also nervous about how Iran is going to retaliate. They're nervous about what that will cause the Israelis to do. None of them wants to become a battleground in a war between Israel and Iran and now the United States. Most of them are hoping that this whole thing is just going to go away and not involve them.
I have to think that there are a lot of Americans who feel that way too, that they just want to be, okay, wait, I didn't vote for this. I didn't want this to happen, and I just would like it to be resolved quickly. What do you think about public support in the United States right now?
Yeah, so I think, I'll be interested to see the first polls when they come out. But my guess is that you're right, that people are conflicted as well. Typically when the United States employs military force, and especially when none of our people get killed, and when it looks like we're being successful, typically the president gets a rally around the flag effect. Most Americans are patriotic. They want to support the president. I think many Americans also recognize that the Iranian regime is odious, right? And they have declared us their enemy and have been trying to harm us for 46 years, right? They've killed at least 1,000 Americans that I can think of. So I don't think there's a whole lot of love for the Iranian regime. By the same token, I think you're also right that right now most Americans aren't looking for another war in the Middle East. And I think that's why President Trump is doing things the way that he's doing them, is he's trying to keep a constant eye on where his own party, where his own base, and perhaps the larger American population is on this, so he doesn't get too out of step with them.
Well, and it's been very interesting to see some of the comments from people that are definitely part of his base, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and even Thomas Massey, come out and say that they're not happy about what's happening there. Let me just ask you two more questions. One, how would you de-escalate the situation right now?
Again, I think the key is that, first, the Israelis are going to finish their aerial campaign. I don't think there's going to be anyone who's going to stop them. I think it would take a lot to get the United States to stop them. And again, I don't think that the Trump administration wants to pick that fight with the Israelis anytime soon. But I think that, very soon the U.S. is going to have to go to the Israelis and say, okay, guys, time to wrap it up. And there, the big question mark is, first, what have the Iranians done already, right? There is this potential for escalation. We talked about it briefly. I think the Iranians are going to feel the need to retaliate against us. They're certainly going to keep shooting at the Israelis. So a big question mark is, what do they do to us? Are we able to just ignore it, which would probably be the best thing of all? Can the Israelis, too, say, well, you know what, Iran's retaliation is getting less and less and less over time. It's really become a nothing burger. We can basically just declare victory and go home. Those are the ideal circumstances. If that doesn't happen, then we get into one of these situations where we're escalating to de-escalate. That's a really terrible path. Let's not even talk about that right now, but that is a danger out there. But assuming that the Israelis are completed their mission, the Iranian retaliation both against us and the Israelis is not terribly damaging, is more symbolic. And by the way, I think it's important to understand, I think that's a very real possibility out there, even probability. What we've seen from Iran's leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, what we've seen from him over the years is he is both a strategic thinker and a prudent decision maker. Right? He is capable of saying, you know what? I can't win this fight, and so it doesn't make sense for me to keep fighting. Right? And that's what we all got to hope. But at that moment in time, as I've said to you several times now, the real key is the long term. How do we prevent this regime from doing what would probably be natural to them, which is to say, well, look, not having a nuclear weapon clearly didn't work for us. It invited these attacks by the Israelis and the Americans. The only way we can defend ourselves in the future is to go ahead and get a nuclear weapon. That's what we've got to prevent them from doing. And I think the best way to do that is to simultaneously go to them and, diplomatically assure them we're not looking for regime change now, provide them with some positive inducements. The president has been clear, willing to lift the sanctions if Iran agrees to give up its nuclear program altogether, agree to far-reaching inspections so we can be sure that they're never going to cheat on it. But then there also has to be the subtle threat that if Iran doesn't agree to do that, that the U.S. and Israel would escalate to something like regime change. I think it's going to take, and that's going to be very, very hard. As I said, that's going to take the skill of a Kissinger or a Bismarck. I hope that the Trump administration proves to have negotiators who are capable of that.
Let me finally ask you, Ken Pollack, you had mentioned that Iran is much bigger than Iraq or Afghanistan, 90 million people in Iran. What is just one or two things that Americans should know about the country of Iran that you've been studying it for so long? What should we know about Iran?
Sure. Just a couple of quick points, Jeremy. I mean, Iranians are extremely proud of their own culture, of their society. They regard themselves as one of the world's great civilizations, right? These are the descendants of the Persian Empire and the Parthian Empire. They ruled much of Southwest Asia, certainly over the Middle East, for thousands of years. And Iranians the vast majority of them see that as the natural order. They have a very capable population. They're often very well educated. They're creative. Think about what went into their nuclear program, their ballistic missile program. This is not necessarily Japan or Taiwan or the United States, but nonetheless, it's a talented, creative, educated population, quite formidable, and also worth understanding. When we think about the Middle East, we think of desert. Iran, the population is overwhelmingly in the mountains. That makes them very difficult militarily. It also anthropologists will tell you that people who live in mountains tend to have very fragmented societies, right? Every mountain valley is its own little thing and very suspicious of everyone else. Think about mountainous parts of the world, how you get these very balkanized political systems, whether it's Afghanistan or the Balkans itself, or, heck, Appalachia and Colorado.
Well, and by the way, I remember hearing about the island of Crete was one of the most difficult places for the Nazis in World War II in part because of the mountains and the people that were up in the mountains.
Exactly. And so you get a very fractious, very fragmented political system, which means it's often kind of tough for them to build a political coalition to do things, right? But it also means that if you're talking about regime change, you don't really know what you're getting. Right? If we went in there, it would probably be more fragmented, fractious than what we saw in places like Iraq, be much more like Afghanistan, which is not a good outcome. It also means that if this regime falls, it's much harder to know what would take its place.
That is Ken Pollack, who's the Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute. So interesting. Ken, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Jeremy. Great questions. Great being here.
And thanks to you for listening to One Thing Trump Did. It was produced by Harrison Patino. Our next middle episode will be in your podcast feed. Later this week, we'll be taking your calls about what's happening with Iran. If you like the podcast, please rate it, write a review. Our theme music was composed by Noah Haidu. I'm Jeremy Hobson. Talk to you soon.
You see it instantly. It's Coldwater Creek, the mark of exceptional workmanship and signature touches inspired by a Mountain West heritage. Distinctive styles created from quality fabrics, silhouettes perfected with just the right drape, feel-good fits offering ease of movement, and thoughtful details to elevate your look. Coldwater Creek's authenticity is embodied in every piece, embracing its confident spirit that carries through to today. Discover Coldwater Creek clothing, designed to fit your life the way you want. For a wardrobe you can count on season after season, visit coldwatercreek.com. Shop the new spring collection at 20% off $75 or more with code IHEART20.
Over the last couple years, Didn't we learn that the folding chair was invented by Black people because of what happened in Alabama?
The Montgomery Brawl.
This Black History Month, the podcast Selective Ignorance with Mandy B unpacks Black history and culture with comedy, clarity, and conversations that shake the status quo. The Crown Act in New York was signed in July of 2019, and that is a bill that was passed to prohibit discrimination based on hairstyles associated with race. To hear this and more, listen to Selective Ignorance with Mandy B from the Black Effect Podcast Network on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
1969. Malcolm and Martin are gone. America is in crisis. And at Morehouse College, the students make their move.
These students, including a young Samuel L. Jackson, locked up the members of the Board of Trustees, including Martin Luther King Sr. It's the true story of protest and rebellion in Black American history that you'll never forget. I'm Hans Charles.
I'm Menelik Lumumba.
Listen to The A Building on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I actually drop better when I'm high. It heightens my senses, calms me down. If anything, I'm more careful. Honestly, it just helps me focus.
That's probably what the driver who killed a 4-year-old told himself. And now he's in prison. You see, no matter what you tell yourself, if you feel different, you drive different. So if you're high, just don't drive. Brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.